Hello, everyone. Welcome to this new initiative that we have as part of LETO, the Learning Theory Alliance initiative. We are starting a series of videos slash podcasts where we are going to be interviewing faculty members that are well known and respected in the community. And we are going to spend half of our time today talking about research-related topics, and half of our time talking about topics beyond research. And this series of podcasts or videos is going to be published basically once every month. And we are extremely excited today to have Jamie Morgenstern with us as our very first guest, actually. Jamie is an assistant professor in the Paul G. Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Washington. She was previously an assistant professor in the School of Computer Science at Georgia Tech. Prior to starting as faculty, she was hosted by Michael Kearns, Aaron Roth, and Rakesh Vora as a Warren Center Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. She completed her PhD working with Avram Blum at Carnegie Mellon University. She studies the social impact of machine learning and the impact of social behavior on machine learning guarantees. For example, how should machine learning be made robust to behavior of people generating training or test data for it? And how should we ensure that the models that we design do not exacerbate inequalities that are already present in society? Jamie, we're very happy to have you. Welcome to the video series of podcasts.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to chat today.
So let's start first with research-oriented topics. So I want to hear more about kind of like the latest research idea, project, or work that you have been excited about.
Yeah. With the caveat that I'm generally thinking about a collection of different things, I've been spending a lot of time the last handful of years thinking about ways in which natural machine learning setup may yield distribution shift for the data that different models have seen. And I think there are a bunch of different examples. But, one simple one, which is motivated at least in part by some practical things I see, which I can talk about in a second, is the idea is that there might be a whole marketplace of machine learning models that individual people are choosing which of those models to use. And that's a setup that I think is relatively natural, if we're thinking about recommendation systems, music recommendations, all the way up to thinking about building large-scale generative models, where like lots of different tech companies are producing these and individuals are choosing which ones to use based on their behavior.
That's super interesting. How do you think of, you mentioned this like marketplace for machine learning models. And I want to ask, how do you think about cases where there is no distinction between different models, or the distinctions cannot be perceived by real people?
Yeah, so I guess if there are a collection of different models that are available, right? If they're indistinguishable, it's not obvious like what kinds of shift individuals might induce, right? So maybe there are 10 different people who are producing models for whatever task. If they're indistinguishable from like an individual data points perspective, then I wouldn't imagine we would necessarily see shifts based on the preferences of those individuals, right? They might just like pick some model. Even if they were to try another one, they wouldn't be able to tell the difference. I don't imagine that would necessarily induce like interesting dynamics. I may be wrong. It depends on how you formalize it, I suppose.
Yeah, so definitely, like, let's consider a particular example. Let's say that how would this marketplace be built? Like, I want to go more into the weeds of what the model looks like and what are the types of dynamics. So, I guess, yeah, like, let's not like have me talk about it. Like, can you tell us a bit more about the model that you're studying here?
Sure. And just to be precise, the particular problem I'm thinking about is in a paper that I imagine you'll post in the show notes. But I'll give I'll use the motivating example of music recommendation just for common parlance. But let's imagine that we have, you know, different music recommendation engines, right? These are, you think of these as like maybe different companies that are producing these, right? So they're not coordinating in any cohesive way. They're sort of doing their own thing. And you can, the model I like to think about, or the one model that's nice to think about, is that each one of the individual companies is producing this model. They're producing it based on their existing training data, right? And they're producing a model, for example, to minimize their risk on their current training data set, right? So they have some training data, they produce a model that works well on that training data. And this happens in a distributed way where each of the different companies produces one of these models. And then there's a whole marketplace of individuals who are looking for music recommendation, right? And one way that might be modeled is I have, either a single distribution or a mixture of distributions over examples XY. And the examples XY will choose which of the different companies to use as a recommendation system based on which one of those different companies produces the best recommendation for them. And that might be formalized as saying, there's some global loss function. You can think about this as 0-1 loss. You could also think about it as squared loss. Squared loss works better in this particular framework. But if you think about this in some kind of regression task, and each individual data point can think about evaluating the prediction that any one of the different companies would make on them, apply the loss function, and see which one has the lowest loss, right? Individuals then say, okay, I like this recommendation from company C that I will choose to use company C's model. Right? That produces a natural distribution of the individuals from the marketplace to the different models. Right? That then gives a new collection of training data to each of the different companies. And the companies could then choose to update their models in a way that is, they could do any number of different things. But a natural thing for them to do would be to say, okay, we have, our old training data, and here's the new training data. If we're going to make an update, we're going to make an update which improves our performance on, perhaps this new training data. And you can think about this as an iterative process, right? Maybe once a month or once a quarter or something, right? The companies come out with new prediction engines. And when that happens, there's some residual behavior where the individual customers are looking around and saying, all right, I paid $10 a month. Which of these 15 different recommendations produces music that I like the best? Okay, I'll spend most of my time and I'll give a subscription to this other company.
That's super interesting. If I'm not mistaken, wouldn't that mean that in maybe kind of like adversarial scenarios, it can be the case that if you have different subpopulations of users, they may end up clustering to different platforms, which is, it's bad for the data that the platforms will want to use because they will not see a big part of the population. And they will only see the segment of the population that chooses them as a result of this like marketplace behavior. Am I correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. This sort of repeated risk minimization on the part of the companies, where they're continuously trying to drive down their loss on their existing population base or on their existing customer base, and customers choosing models which are individually good for them in terms of loss. Right? These dynamics naturally and almost always, and we formalize exactly what we mean by this, will lead to like partitioning of the population, right? That basically if you have two different distributions of users where like our S's and Y's are correlated in different ways, right? It's almost always the case that like all of the users from population 1 will cohabitate on one of these platforms. It's not necessarily the case. If one model is truly really good for all the population simultaneously, right? All the population simultaneously might choose to use that one model. But it is the case that like sort of being the best model for a particular population will sort of have a rich gets richer effect. In that, like, if you're the best one, that means that more customers who are like your existing customers will choose to use that model, right? Which will then increase the weight of that population in terms of the optimization that company is doing, and there is a natural dynamic that leads to what we call segmented markets.
Well, that's super interesting. And is it in the platforms almost like, maybe that's what you're alluding to, but is it in the platform's best interest to try to like enlarge the user base that they have, or is it in their interest to like double down as the market gets originally, like, initially segmented? Should the platform try to optimize for loss functions for other groups, or just they should just like double down?
Right. So we haven't talked so much about like exactly what the objective function of anyone in this market is. We've sort of all I've defined thus far is that like the behavior patterns. Individual customers are sort of trying to pick a model which minimizes their loss, at least in a one-step fashion, and that the companies are updating their models to reduce their loss averaged over their current set of customers, right? Now, what does that correspond to? I mean, I guess that behavior corresponds to on the part of the company, corresponds to it corresponds to doubling down, I suppose, right? It's not clear that that's like, it depends on what their true objective function is, right? Like, this isn't just like a thing they could do. And I think in many cases, something that is fairly natural that like probably, depending upon exactly what context we're talking about, repeated risk minimization is something that's appeared both in the literature and like occurs in practice a lot. It's one of the ways people deal with distribution shift, right? They just say, okay, well, we're going to sort of like ignore exactly why our distribution shifting, but one way we can address the fact that it might be shifting and not, become too dependent upon our initial training set is to repeatedly retrain. Whether or not this is an objective function, like minimizing your risk on your current set of customers, whether that captures what companies actually care about will probably depend a lot on exactly the context you're thinking about, right? If you care about protecting your existing customer base, this might not be a terrible idea. But it, in general, will not allow you to. It depends, right? If you're getting $10 a month from any person who chooses to subscribe to you, right? This may or may not be a way, and in general won't be a way to maximize the number of customers you get.
Yeah, no, I get it. That's super interesting. I guess like a related notion is I'm very well aware with about this literature called on performative prediction, which talks again about a particular type of distribution shift that may arise as a result of how the agents or users to choose to change their data. And I was curious. From what I understand, the distribution shift that you are having in mind is closer to the machine learning definition of distribution shift rather than the more like game theoretic view of the world that I just got in mind.
Yeah, so let me think about that for a second. So I think there are a bunch of different ways in which a distribution might change out from under a model. We're not necessarily thinking about people manipulating their features explicitly to get different recommendation, right? Which is also, in some context, maybe the appropriate thing to think about. We're sort of thinking about it is sort of strategic behavior, but in a different sense. Sort of saying you have choices, you only have a finite amount of time and money to spend on some of these platforms, and you're going to choose the one that does the best for you, right? And that is sort of from the perspectives of the customers, a somewhat strategic choice that leads to a change in the set of examples that the different customer or the different companies will get. It's true that it's not the same as like imagining basically like people are regularly manipulating their features to get outcomes they prefer from a given model. And that's definitely something that captures this world where there may be fewer companies to choose from, where if there's like a lot more monopolistic or semi-monopolistic power, right? That might be something that captures things better. Related, not relatedly, but I'm just speaking off from the hip, I guess here. It might be interesting to think about like an interesting combination of these things, right? So once there's a model that sort of works best for you, it's still not clear that there wouldn't be some feature manipulation. Yeah. And I haven't thought about sort of what happens when you interleave both the ability to choose between models and the ability to do some feature manipulation. I do think that Sarah Dean, who's one of my co-authors on this paper, I think she may have thought a small amount about something related to this. I would want to verify that in the last year or so there hasn't been like recent work that has sort of interleaved these ideas.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. I want to focus on something that you said in passing about this, that there can be, even in your setting, that if you had like more of a monopolistic setting, you would expect to see people try to strategize more. And I'm wondering, is this similar to what happens sometimes with like ride sharing apps where, because sure, like there's not a monopoly, but there are, I don't know, like 3, 4 at the time. It's still possible for users, even if they haven't prepared the ride sharing app, to, strategize and be like, oh, I'll just go online on both apps, and whichever arrives first, I'm going to take it and cancel the other one. If you had like 10 or 20 such apps, it wouldn't be possible. You would have to stick with your 1 or 2 preferred ones. So would your model in the paper that you had, would it be able to accommodate for this behavior?
Yes, I think so. In the sense that so the simplest version I described is that like the customers pick the model which works best for them deterministically in every iteration, and that the companies produce a model which minimizes the risk on their current customer base. But everything we're talking about works in an approximate sense. So like rather than risk minimizing or loss minimizing, loss reducing is also acceptable, right? And so an update that might be appropriate is like, I try 1 or 2 things today and I pick the one that's better. And as far as risk reducing is fine too. And I think it's also fine in expectation. So I believe that like, doing something that's sampling based would also work just fine.
Nice. Interesting. So
Yeah.
again, like to take a step back, in this work, you are analyzing the dynamics of the system that arises kind of naturally in these like applications of interest, and to analyze how the population gets segmented essentially, and what is the marketplace that is produced. Would you like to tell us a bit more about how you moved into this area, how you started getting interested, and how it relates to topics that you were studying in the past?
Yeah, certainly. I think there were a few. I think it's easy to write a story sort of on top of what you've done and say like this is the narrative that got me here. And there certainly are some things that motivated me to think about these sorts of problems. But sometimes the description after the fact is maybe not like the most reliable way to describe how you ended up somewhere. Anyway, I think this came to mind for a couple of reasons, but in general, I'm very interested in how people choose, how to spend their time, and the fact that there are, at least in some contexts, pretty vibrant and distinct groups of companies that are providing similar services. So like music recommendations, which is the one I keep harping back on, is harping upon is only one example. You know, if we think about sites we're using to get recommendations for where to stay when we go on a trip, or if we think about, you know, being small businesses who are trying to do online advertising, or if we think about, you know, maybe the sexiest example, if we're a small business that is hoping to use large language models to answer some of our customer service requests. Somewhat miraculously, in all of those cases, I think we have several decent choices, right? We have several different companies, even of these large tech companies, that are doing interesting, novel, creative model engineering. And they're not all good in the same ways. Right? I think, you know, I think some audiophiles really like Tidal as a music recommendation, or as a not even necessarily music recommendation, but like a music listening platform, right? If you grew up roughly in my age generation, it's very hard to move off of Pandora, even if you also listen to Spotify sometimes, right? You just like, you have some stickiness to Pandora. Pandora knows like 20 years of your music preferences, and, you know, it's hard to like take that information and give it to some other engine that doesn't know as much about you. And even for, you know, social media apps and these sorts of things. I was also, I'm sort of interested in how people choose which of these to use, right? And how much what type of things you like affect what you end up choosing. It's not obvious to me how much of the decisions in social media apps have to do with like what your social network likes versus what these things recommend to you. And it probably depends a lot on the particular example you're talking about. Yeah, I mean, I think I am very interested in understanding what happens in scenarios where like there is some interesting competition between companies to do a good job in terms of prediction, and sort of what natural consequences might arise because of that.
Do you think that like, what are some other considerations beyond probably just prediction accuracy that people may have in mind? Like, off the top of my head, I can imagine that maybe someone is like, look, like this, like Spotify, I'm just shooting like a name out loud, that maybe Spotify has a better like data privacy agreement with me. So I'm willing to take the hit for, you know, not equally as good recommendations, but my data will be saved. So what other types of considerations do you envision that people will have?
Yeah, and I think in general, right, this idea that like there's mixed objectives for individuals in a marketplace is something that's very nice to think about, right? Like maybe I care, you know, I think we've sort of posited this idea that like everybody, there's one global loss function, and maybe, you know, individual customers care about that loss applied to them specifically, and the companies are sort of minimizing the average of that same loss function applied to their example. It definitely makes sense to imagine that people have different objectives. Analyzing markets of that type, I think, is a very interesting thing to think about. One sort of silly, contrived thing you could say is that, like, if each training point came with its own loss function, like you were able to, hey, this is what I care about when you're making predictions about me, right? If you explicitly expressed that, I think that might still fall within the same setup we have, although it's like, you know, in a fairly contrived way. You know, if individuals completely express their own loss function, then I think like a lot of the same analysis will go through, assuming that the companies are like averaging those individualized losses applied to each of the training data points. You know, if I know that Chara really cares a lot about privacy, well, then, I mean, I'm not sure exactly how we're going to formalize privacy here, but like in theory, if like the only thing that like I'm using your data for is making predictions for you, then maybe that's like not too hard to accomplish.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you think that yeah, I guess that's like a spicy question, but do you think that people have, like real people, do they have any other considerations apart from who gives me the best recommendations? I'll just go there.
Well, I mean, I think in the context of recommendations, which I've thought about in other, in other research projects, I suppose, I don't know. I think the short answer is recommendations are like a fairly complex object, right? Am I looking for a single recommendation one time? Or am I looking for like a distribution over stuff that changes over time? Do I want it to be like really narrowly concentrated on, I don't know, Keegan and Sarah forever? Or do I want it to expose me to new things? Do I want it to maybe open up my aperture to something broader? I think what people want out of recommendations changes depending upon exactly what kind of problem you're thinking about and upon what time horizon you're thinking, especially because in some contexts, you can really think about recommendations shaping preferences.
Yes.
Yeah. And if you think about, spending lots of time on, on any number of different video sharing apps, right? Video sharing platform, I think, and this happens not just for video sharing, but that's sort of a setting in which I think we know a lot about this. Sometimes these recommendation systems sort of rabbit hole people, right? Sometimes they steer them. And so I think there are lots of interesting questions there about sort of what the right objectives are for the platforms, and also sort of if we are aware that the recommendations we're making might actually shape people's preferences, how to better engineer such systems.
That's super interesting. So, would you be interested to do any of the more like social science type of work, try to understand what people really are interested and what they are looking for in recommendations, or do you envision your research in this area to be mostly in the theoretical and practical aspect?
I think I'm certainly interested in both sides. My expertise is in the latter, as you allude, but with the right collaborators who are who have some expertise in actually doing like human subject evaluation, I think that's something that's very interesting. I will remark that one great place that I've found, and I think lots of people find, for doing some work that actually looks at like human preferences and behavior is with affiliations and collaborations with folks who work in industry research labs, because there you may get like direct interaction with some of the customers of those companies, and or the ability to deploy things at scale, be they surveys, be they A/B tests of various types. And I think that is one of the pieces of having, ongoing collaborations in industry that I think is very rich and worthwhile.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. For someone who is like a more junior student and they want to get into this area, but they don't know where to start. Would you like to provide like some ideas about the types of tools that you use, the types of techniques? I know we talked about the model and the dynamics, but maybe let's just expand a bit more on what types of tools and techniques people would need to get started.
Yeah, and I will say, this project in particular, it doesn't. I wouldn't say from first principles, but I would say that like a lot of these results don't rely on a lot of really heavy hammers. Many of them come from some pretty basic tools from like relatively beginning sort of perspectives on like interactive game theory. So one of the easiest ways to analyze these dynamics that I've thought of, at least, is that it naturally is predisposed to being set up to describe it as a potential game. If you're familiar with potential games, then that's a place to look. If not, I think there's a really nice collection of descriptions in the algorithmic game theory, like an initial text. And I think, any introductory algorithmic game theory set of course notes are often a nice place to start. Right? There are lots of nice things there. And, I think understanding sort of what systems have a natural potential function, which is just like something you can apply to a current state. And then as dynamics occur, does that same function, can you apply it to the next state? And is it the case that that value of that function always decreases as these dynamics occur? So, I think that there's that's one of the primary tools that we use to analyze some of the things in this paper. That would be the first thing I would think of to suggest. I think this paper doesn't necessarily like rely on, the latest and greatest, like recent techniques from like, yeah, of course. But I just, that's a nice place to start. There are lots of great things in sort of the like foundational texts from some of these fields.
Yeah, it takes me back to when I was first reading about the potential games in the classical American game theory books.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I want to switch gears for the last part of our conversation. And I want to talk about some topics beyond research. This is like the second segment of the podcast video series that we're going to be doing. So I know you're a professor, and we know that you have a lot of students that you're working with. What is your most favorite thing about working with students?
So there are a lot of things I like, and I'll probably not say the one that I actually like the most, but I'll say some things that I like. I really enjoy watching students learn new skills and become like masters of pieces of being independent researchers. I think generally when students start, they have certainly some of the skills, but like everybody comes in with pieces that they're definitely not independent researchers in this particular direction, and sort of watching as they gain momentum and expertise in the different facets of being independent researchers is probably one of my favorites. Yeah, and also just like watching the cool things that they do, right? Student when they start to learn and become more independent, they produce all sorts of cool things. That's very exciting.
Yeah, that's indeed wonderful. Did you know from the early stages of your PhD that you wanted to be a professor and be in academia, or was it something that came later to you?
So I would say that it was always one thing that one of the possibilities that intrigued me. I've always liked being able to do and think about the things that I was most excited about, and this is sort of, in many ways, the position that allows you to do that most freely. I will say that, like, it wasn't obvious to me always that was going to be either possible or maybe something that would like fulfill me. So, I think graduate school has lots of ups and downs for everyone. And life beyond graduate school, right? Life in general has lots of phases which are sort of more and less pleasant and fulfilling. And there was a period in graduate school where a friend of mine and I met for coffee once a week, and we talked about how much we wanted to quit grad school.
And everyone has these stories.
Not everyone tells them. And I think, and I think, there's sort of like the wandering through the forest phase of your PhD, which feels like it will never end and it will never sort of turn into something meaningful, and that is a hard phase to make your way through. And so I think during that time it was like, well, I can't figure out what else that I would do, but also this doesn't really seem possible or enjoyable either. Yeah, I also think, it depends on where you're going to graduate school, but it's tough because you don't see a lot of examples of what people do besides become faculty, right? Your mentors, largely speaking, are faculty. Sort of their most successful students are also faculty, and so it's hard to even know what the opportunities outside of becoming faculty with your expertise necessarily are. But yeah, it was definitely always one of the things I held as a possibility. Plus, I'm sort of uh yeah, I don't know at what point I decided that, like, I think until I had faculty job offers in my hand, I still wasn't sure if this was gonna happen or not.
Happens to all of us exactly the same way. Yeah, so I wanted to touch upon two things here. The first one had to do with these like dark periods of the PhD that you mentioned earlier. But let me start by the lighter one, the second one, which is that I feel that increasingly there are more and more like research opportunities for folks to work not in academia. I mean, like industry research, but not be professors. Yeah, like do you see this shift happening like increasingly, or am I just like saying this to myself?
So I think it depends upon which aspects. There are definitely lots of great research positions not in academic institutions, right? Um, where exactly those reside and what they look like change over time. So, I'm just enough more years into this process that I've seen a few more shifts perhaps than you have. So I think how it, so there are lots of large and small tech companies that have researchers doing foundational research at them. I think that how prevalent those opportunities are and sort of what they look like shift over time, right? And also just like within a given organization, how comfortable those organizations are with open publishing models and those sorts of things. Also, I want to give a shout out to there being like interesting nonprofits and governmental organizations at which you can also do interesting basic research. Although, in all of these cases, corporations or down to nonprofits and government, there's usually some guidance that there should be some impact of what you're doing on something beyond basic research. So I think there are definitely lots of those kinds of opportunities. I think sort of how prevalent and what those look like vary based on market conditions and all sorts of others. Research labs open and close, and sort of what the higher level organization expects from their researchers varies over time.
Yeah, no, you're so right. You're so right. So going back to the kind of like the sad topic of like dark times around PhD, do you like if you could go back and give like one advice to your younger self as a junior PhD student going through the tough times, what would it be? Like, what would you do differently?
So I don't know if I would have done anything differently per se. I think you said, right, like everybody goes through some periods which are much more challenging. Almost everyone, maybe not everyone. I can think of a few people who I'm not sure if they would describe that, but but I think a large fraction of people who do go on to be successful do have these periods. Is maybe useful. So I think knowing that you're not alone in that is uh, a good perspective. I think and having things outside of work that make you happy is definitely an important piece, right? Because like work isn't always going to make you happy. So having other things you can get joy from that's an important tool when you're going through those harder periods.
So what are some other things that you are doing to maintain like work-life balance? People keep telling me as a very junior faculty that it gets easier to have like a balance, and we do say that all the time to junior PhD students as well. But it's good to like say out loud that hey, I maintain work-life balance by doing these things.
Yeah, and that's I think I don't know if I would call it balance per se, but like I think you sort of topple back and forth between like phases where you're like spending a lot of time at one thing and a lot of time at another. So I think leading up to if I think most people who like to do research are people who really get deeply involved in things. And I, for example, have a hard time doing things halfway, right? If I really care about something, so much time doing it. And if I don't care about something, it's very hard for me to spend 5 or 10 minutes on it. And so finding, I think if you have things you're passionate about beyond just like the current research project you're working on, you'll find ways to fit it in, right? And there will be periods where you completely neglect something you care about at and then there will be times where you like give that all of your attention, right? That's just sort of how at least I work and do the rest of my life, right? That's how I operate. And so finding things you love to do and doing them, and it doesn't always have to be that you have the same ratio of your time you're spending doing all the things, work and non-work and whatever else. Yeah, I think it's just figuring out how to flop back and forth in a way that works for you in your life is important.
Thank you for sharing that. Well, on this like hopeful message and high note, I'd like to thank Jamie for spending an hour with us today, talking to us about research and topics beyond research. Yeah, anything else that you would like to say before we close?
No, thank you so much, and I really appreciated chatting with you today.
Of course. Thank you for being here once again. Bye, everyone.